Hi, this is Carrie Cooper for Guitar Centre's Focus on Rock. The sitar, that beautiful sounding plucked instrument from India that somehow went on to find another life, epitomising the 1960s psychedelic scene. That melding of traditional Indian sounds and Western popular rock music would create a rich and mystic style within an already thought-provoking scene for the young and curious mind. Classical Indian musician and sitar player Ravi Shankar is largely celebrated for bringing those worlds together where East meets West, with of course a little help from an inspired young George Harrison. So how did George Harrison charm the Indian maestro, and how did that creative friendship go on to blaze the trail for what is now known as the Great Sitar Explosion? I guess a great place to start would be the first time Harrison ever heard the instrument being played. It was in fact the Byrds' founder, guitarist and singer Roger McGuinn that claims to have introduced the young Beatle to that exotic sound, and in particular the music of Ravi Shankar. The year was 1965 and the place was a particularly lively party at Zsa Zsa Gabor's Hollywood mansion. According to McGuinn, they were both on LSD at the time, and so inspired by the sound was Harrison that it led him to travel to India to learn how to play the sitar himself. The first time we'd hear Harrison reference the sitar was in the wonderful Norwegian Wood from the album Rubber Soul, late in 1965, a year before the pair actually met. It might be fair to say that the sitar appreciation was not an all-Beatle one, but more deeply rooted in George alone. Love You Too from the Revolver album was produced post Harrison's meeting and coaching sessions with Ravi Shankar and saw the sitar dominate a Beatles song for the first time. The instrument would go on to make appearances in 3 Beatles albums, Rubber Soul, Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with the song Within You, Without You. The relationship between Ravi Shankar and George Harrison was a strong personal one that would go on to last for decades, and their creative bond was powerful enough to help the sitar make a profound impact on the large musical life of the late 60s and still rings as evocative of that time today. Ravi Shankar himself coined the term the Great Sitar Explosion, that surreal time for the instrument and Indian classical music in general, in 1966 and 67. When interviewed in 68, he said, "It's strange seeing pop musicians with sitars. When George Harrison came to me, I didn't know what to think, but I found he really wanted to learn. I never thought our meeting would create such an explosion that Indian music would suddenly appear on the pop scene. It's peculiar." He also found the idea that the Beatle made him famous a bizarre concept, considering he'd already been enjoying considerable success in his own country. There was also a slight underlying resentment in later years that he'd somehow been made a pop star. With that tidal wave of Western infatuation with Indian music subsiding later that decade, Shankar, along with other classical musicians of that genre, couldn't help but feel that their traditions had been exploited for commercial gain. But George Harrison was only at the very beginning of what would prove a lifelong relationship with both Indian music and spirituality, and his interest and passion would remain loyal throughout his lifetime. In 1971, moved by Ravi's concern for the suffering in Bangladesh due to the civil war there and the flooding, George produced 2 concerts at New York's Madison Square Garden. The concert was star-studded and included Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, Bob Dylan, Billy Preston, Leon Russell and of course Ravi himself. The concerts were made into a film and an album, with proceeds still going to the George Harrison Fund for UNICEF more than 40 years later. And in 1973, Harrison went on to produce the album Shankar Family and Friends, a collaborative Indian music album that would be the pair's first studio album collaboration, and was one of the first ever albums released on the ex-Beatles Dark Horse label. It was on this album that Ravi's first ever pop record would emerge in the seminal I Am Missing You, a love song to the Hindu god Krishna. In 1974, while interviewed on BBC Radio 1, Harrison told of the first time he ever heard that song from Shankar. "It just blew my mind because I heard it from my pop background. I said to him, 'This is a hit, it's a lovely song. You should write more of these, Ravi.' And he said, 'Oh, you know, I've been trying not to write these for years.'" This is Carrie Cooper for Guitar Centre's Focus on Rock. Shop for the greatest selection of music gear on earth in store or at guitarcentre.com.